A Boeing 747 with 524 people on board suddenly loses its tail at 24,000 feet. The flight crew is left with no controls and no direction. There's no oxygen or air pressure in the cabin. Yet, for the next 45 minutes, they somehow manage to keep the plane in the air. This is the story of human determination, engineering failures, and a flight that had lost all control. Japan Airlines, Flight 123. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Boeing 747 was at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. A flight was getting ready to take off. It was supposed to head to Osaka exactly an hour later. Thousands of people travel from Tokyo to Osaka every day, but today was especially busy due to the Japanese holiday season, Obon, when people head back to their hometowns. After cleaning the plane at Haneda, Japan Air 123 welcomed 509 passengers and 15 crew members on board. For the crew, it was just another routine flight, but the passengers had no idea that the plane they were about to board had an old flaw. The situation was a terrifying issue that neither the pilots nor the flight engineer were aware of. This particular Boeing 747 was about to embark on its sixth flight of the day due to a busy schedule. Speaking to the cockpit crew, the captain, Masami Takahama, who was 49 years old, was leading the flight with a total of 12,000 hours of experience. The first officer, Yutaka Sasaki, 39, was already in the process of being promoted to captain, and this flight was crucial for his promotion, boasting a total of 3,900 hours of experience. The third cockpit crew member was a 46-year-old flight engineer, Hiroshi Fukuda, who was in charge of monitoring the technical issues from behind the pilot seats. Looking at the cockpit crew's capabilities, it's safe to say that the lives of 509 passengers were in good hands. But the real question was whether the plane itself was up to the task. That would soon become clear. At 6:04 p.m., the doors of Japan Air 123 were closed, and the pilot began taxiing the plane to runway 15L. This was going to be a pretty short flight from Tokyo to Osaka, just 1 hour and 12 minutes. The plane would reach cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, and at that point, preparations for landing would begin. The weather in Tokyo was clear, but there were several thunderstorms popping up over Japan that day, so the pilot was instructed to take a route over the ocean instead of flying directly to Osaka. Runway 15L was all set for Japan Air 123 to take off. After getting clearance from the control tower at 6:12, the pilot pushed the thrust levers up and successfully took off. Everything so far had been totally normal, but just 12 seconds after takeoff, and minutes later, a strange noise comes from inside the plane over Sagami Bay, and suddenly there's a hole at the back of the tail section. Passengers, who were all excited about going home, find their excitement turning to terror in the blink of an eye. The wind from the hole fills the cabin, and loose items start getting sucked towards it. Everything happens so fast that it's hard to even figure out what's going on. The sound was so loud that it can be heard in the cockpit too. In the recording, the sound felt something like this. It's important to know that as the plane climbs in altitude, the air outside gets thinner and the oxygen levels drop. To counter this, they pump artificial pressure inside the cabin that's roughly equal to what you'd find at ground level. This means that at 24,000 feet, the pressure outside is lower, while the pressure inside the cabin is higher. This extra air pressure is constantly pushing against the walls of the cabin. The plane's cabin is kept completely airtight to ensure this. Artificial pressure shouldn't leak in any way, but if even a small part of the cabin is weak, the air pressure can rip through it, creating a hole. This would lead to the loss of the cabin's artificial pressure, causing passengers to feel unwell. Plus, low oxygen levels could make it hard to breathe. Something similar happened with Japan Air Flight 123, but the pilots were unaware of it. The cockpit voice recorder captured them talking about the landing gear door being broken. When they talked about it, they sometimes thought maybe the noise was coming from the engine. But the truth was that the tail of the fuselage had completely separated from the plane, taking the rudder with it. Because the tail of the fuselage blew apart, it meant that the cabin couldn't maintain pressure anymore. The rudder, which is this part on the tail, coming off, meant that the plane was about to go out of control for both pilots. The rudder's job is to manage the plane's movement. Anytime a plane turns, that's called a roll movement, whether the nose is up or down. The movement is called pitch, while when the nose moves left or right, that's referred to as your movement. To put it simply, Japan Air 123, at around 24,000 feet, couldn't turn properly or align with the runway during landing due to the loss of the rudder. But what's even more dangerous is that the pilots had no idea the rudder was gone. The plane wasn't stable anymore and started to sway left and right on its own, which the autopilot couldn't handle. Down on the ground, a guy saw the plane. Seeing this movement, something felt off, so he took a picture. In this photo, it's clear that part of the rudder is missing from the tail. The two pilots hadn't grasped the situation yet, but the cabin crew was heard making announcements telling passengers to buckle their seatbelts and stay in their seats. Meanwhile, the captain in the cockpit sensed something was wrong, so he first switched the transponder to frequency 703, which is a universal distress signal. This meant all control towers would know that Japan Air 123 was in an emergency situation. The captain decided to take the plane back to Tokyo, but the real question was whether the plane could even handle that. First, they informed the control tower about the emergency situation and requested permission to land in Tokyo. The control tower granted the captain permission to make a 90-degree turn and land in Tokyo. The first officer, who was at the controls, turned the plane to the right at a 40-degree angle. But both pilots got really freaked out when they saw that the plane's angle was way more than 40 degrees. At that point, the captain could be heard shouting at the first officer to reduce the bank angle. The pilots were trying hard, but the plane just wasn't responding to any of their inputs. Suddenly, the flight engineer piped up, letting both pilots know that the hydraulic pressure was dropping fast, and before they knew it, it hit zero. That was the moment when all three crew members in the cockpit realized that the plane was now out of their control. Just so you know, the plane's controls include ailerons for turning left or right, elevators for pitch, and flaps to reduce speed. During the flight, especially when you're flying at 1,000 kilometers and the wind is hitting you head-on, it's nearly impossible to wave your hands around. That's why they use hydraulic pressure to move things. The tail of Japan Air 123 had also ripped off some hydraulic pipes, which meant the entire hydraulic pressure of the plane was lost. So, the cockpit controls just sat there like a decoration. At 24,000 feet, Japan Air 123 was dealing with multiple issues. The cabin pressure was gone, and the oxygen masks had deployed because of the loss of hydraulic pressure. The controls had failed, and the scariest part was that both the passengers and pilots were starting to experience hypoxia due to low pressure. Hypoxia is when the body's oxygen levels drop, leading to confusion, making it hard to think straight, slow movements, and even passing out. In the midst of this, the cabin crew announced that everyone should put on their oxygen masks. What happened next was terrifying. Japan Air 123 was rolling erratically, putting the passengers in a panic. and the two pilots were left with only one option. There were controls left, specifically the engine controls. The captain tried to get the plane back on track using just the engine controls. If he wanted to make a right turn, he had to increase the power on the left engines, and for a left turn, he'd boost the power on the right engines. So, when the plane started to bank to the right, he just had to crank up the power on the right engines for a moment to straighten it out. Using this method, the pilots managed to regain a lot of control over the plane's roll movement. Now their mission was just one thing. The idea was to get the plane back on the ground at Tokyo Airport as quickly as possible, but first, we needed to bring it closer to the ground to increase the cabin pressure. Normally, we would use elevators for this, but they were useless due to the lack of hydraulic pressure. So, the captain suggested deploying the landing gear. The landing gear creates extra drag, which can slow us down, but it also opens with hydraulic pressure. Therefore, the captain decided to try and deploy the landing gear just using its own weight. Luckily, they managed to open up. Now, at 6:45, Japan Air 123 makes a loop over the city of Atsugi, dropping its altitude from 24,000 feet to 13,500 feet, which was a big win for the pilots. Both cabin pressure and oxygen levels improved, but the danger still wasn't over. They needed to take a right turn towards Tokyo, but turning the plane using just the engine controls was proving really difficult for the pilots. If they increased the engine thrust, the nose of the plane would rise too much, which would slow down the speed, and if the speed dropped too low, the plane could end up crashing to the ground without wanting to. Now, it had entered the mountainous region of Japan. Turning the plane towards Tokyo at such a low altitude without any controls seemed like an impossible task. At 6:48, the captain was heard telling the first officer to make a right turn because there were mountains ahead. But it seemed like it wasn't possible to make such a precise turn with just the engine controls. At that moment, all sorts of alarms were going off in the cockpit. And despite everything, the plane had reached just 6,800 feet, far away from Tokyo, over the mountain range. Minutes later, at 6:54 p.m., you could really hear the captain's frustration in his voice. And finally, after 2 minutes, some sounds were recorded in the cockpit. The Japan airplane crashed into a mountain while making a turn because it was flying at a low altitude. Only 4 people survived, and they were sitting on the left side in the center of the cabin. All the crew and other passengers lost their lives in this tragic accident. The investigation revealed that 7 years earlier, the same plane had its tail hit the runway while landing, and it was grounded for several weeks for repairs after that. Boeing's technicians were working on repairs, and the investigation revealed that they had installed the tail's splice plate incorrectly. Investigators calculated that this faulty repair could only handle 11,000 pressure cycles, while Japan Air 123 had already completed 12,500 cycles under the same conditions. Coincidentally, it couldn't withstand the pressure on the same day. After the accident, investigators put 4 different pilots through the same situation in a flight simulator, but all 4 crashed the plane. No other pilot has managed to keep a plane in the air as long as Japan Air 123 did, which is pretty surprising. The pilots in the simulator had 2 huge advantages. They knew beforehand what the problem was, and they weren't worried about their lives. Given these conditions, it wouldn't be wrong to say that both pilots of Japan Air 123 fought hard to control the aircraft and kept it in the air for 45 minutes. Hope you guys like and share this video. Thanks a ton for all the love-filled comments, everyone. Catch you in the next awesome video.